Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Sukkah Daf Zayin contains 3 sugyas. The first sugya is discussing the half wall that you can make in a sukkah. Where does that piece of wall, where does that attach to? How do you set that up within the 3 walls that are required for the sukkah? The second discussion will be, if you have a sukkah which is kosher, does that make it a kosher enclosure for Hilchos Shabbos, for carrying as well? And vice versa, if you have an enclosure for Hilchos Shabbos, does that make it kosher for sukkah, even if it doesn't necessarily meet the requirements of a sukkah? The Gemara then discusses briefly about having shade in the sukkah, if that shade can be created by walls or it has to be created by the sukkah, by the schach. And then the Gemara will list a number of Tanaim who all hold that a sukkah has to be a permanent, or at least befitting to be a permanent residence, and the Gemara will explain where we see each of those Tanaim hold away. So first of all, the Gemara is discussing the piece of wall. We know we had seen that one of the walls of a sukkah is allowed to be just a tafach wide. We had seen a machlokes Tanaim, whether that's the 3rd wall or the 4th wall. You need to have a total of 3 walls, one of which is small, or a total of 4 walls, one of which is small, but we're going to go now with the opinion that you need 2 walls, plus the 3rd wall is allowed to be just a tefach wide. The Gemara wants to know, where does that tefach have to go? So the Gemara first discusses if the 2 walls you have are arranged in an L shape. The Gemara says that Rav and Shmuel said that you put the extra tefach on the ends of the L, either end of the L, not in the middle. You put it on either end of the L, and it should be perpendicular to the corner in which it's attached and parallel to the other wall. So that way you have somewhat like a face where you have an L with a little piece hanging on either opposite end. So the Gemara asks, why do you have to make it straight? Why does it have to be parallel to the opposite wall and perpendicular to the near wall? Let it be at an angle. Let it be bent inward at an angle so that it's angled from the corner at which it's attached all the way to the opposite corner. Wouldn't that be a better way to do things? It almost seems to fill the function of 2 walls then, and it makes the whole thing look like a triangular enclosure. So Gemara says this question was asked, and Rav was quiet. It was asked to Rav. Rav was quiet. He did not respond. Rav Kahana and Rav Asi asked the question. So now the Gemara brings another opinion, and this is Rav Simon, or possibly Rav Yeshua ben Levi, and they say what you do is as follows. You have your L-shaped walls. Those are 2 good walls. And then you take another piece of wall which is slightly larger than a tefach. That's what the Gemara calls a tefach soichek, a happy tefach, because it's expanded, slightly larger than a tefach. And you put it perpendicular to a corner, but not attached to the corner. You put it spaced just under 3 tefachim from that corner. That means that you now have a gap of less than 3 tefachim between your extra tefach and the rest of the sukkah. A gap of less than 3 tefachim is considered to be closed through the rule of lavud. And since your piece of wall was slightly more than a tefach, you have a total of 4 tefachim. 4 tefachim is the majority of 7 tefachim. And we know the minimum size of a wall is 7 tefachim in width. And therefore you now have the majority of a full wall. And that's Rav Simon's opinion. You should try to set it up in such a way that your 1 tefach using lavud and rov creates an actual 3rd wall. Now the Gemara discusses what happens if the 2 kosher walls that you have are parallel to each other. So the Gemara says that Rav Yehuda says you can have 2 kosher walls that are parallel to each other. That's fine. You just have to put your tefach anywhere you want. You can put it on either open side, and any part of the open side, it's fine. Now Rav Simon and possibly Yeshua ben Levi says no. Here you cannot have a tefach in the open side. You have to have 4 tefachim. The 3rd wall, which will be half a wall, has to be a minimum of 4 tefachim, and you can put that spaced from either of the other walls, and you can have lava to any of the other walls, and that's kosher. So Gemara says, why does this type of setup require 4 tefachim, while if the walls are shaped like an L, the existing walls, it only requires 1 tefach, and then a bit more than that, it only requires a tefach soichek. The Gemara says because when 2 walls meet and form a corner, that's 2 kosher walls. 2 walls that are parallel to each other don't form any corners. That's not a kosher wall, and therefore you need to have a 4 tefach piece of wall to create a kosher wall situation of some sort in order for it to be able to work. Now the Gemara quotes Rava. Rava says you you have to have a tzuras hapesach. That means you have to have a frame. You have to have two side posts and a cross beam going across the top. And the Gemara is not sure. The Gemara has two versions as to what Rava means. One version is that Rava is saying this makes things easier. You do not have to have your third wall be a full tefach in one spot. You could have half a tefach on one end of the wall, half a tefach on the other end of the wall, with a beam going across the top. Because it's a tzuras pesach, it looks like a doorway. It's a door frame, and it looks like a doorway. That's kosher, even though you don't have a full tefach in one spot. Whereas the other version is that no, we're referring to where you do have a tefach in one spot, and Rava is making it stricter, and he's saying you need to have a full door frame besides for the tefach running all the way to the other end of that wall, and that's the only way you have a kosher wall. So Gemara says that we observed Rav Ashi, observed Rav Kahana, who did it the strict way. He made the tefach soichek of Rav Simon, made the extra wide tefach, and he made a tzuras pesach. So I asked him, why are you doing both those things? And he said, I hold like the version of Rava that you need to do the two things. You have to have the tefach and the tzuras pesach. So I'm using Rav Simon's design for the tefach, and I'm doing tzuras pesach, a door frame, for the rest of it. Okay, now the Gemara says a statement of Rava that any sukkah which is kosher in Hilchos Sukkah is also kosher in Hilchos Shabbos. Generally in Hilchos Shabbos, in order to be allowed to carry, in order to consider a region to be a Rishus HaYachid, you have to have at least 3 walls enclosing it. Says Rava, it's enough if you have 2 walls and a piece if it's a sukkah. If it's a kosher sukkah and it's Shabbos which is on Sukkot. So because it functions as a sukkah, it gets a lift up and it functions as a Rishus HaYachid also. Normally in Hilchos Shabbos it would not count as Rishus HaRabim, it would not count as Rishus HaYachid, and if it would be any other Shabbos, or if it wouldn't be a kosher sukkah, it wouldn't count as a Rishus HaRabim, meaning if it didn't have, let's say, schach on it, it would not count as a Rishus HaYachid, I'm sorry. However, since this is a kosher sukkah, it also counts as a Rishus HaYachid as far as Hilchos Shabbos is concerned. So the Gemara first of all attacks this, and then brings 2 more similar statements of Rava. The Gemara's attack here is, we have a brayso that seems to say otherwise. The brayso says pretty clearly, and Abaye asks this kasha, that if you have you could have the walls of a sukkah the same as the walls of a Shabbos, with the exceptions of the halachas that are different between them. And it says as follows, that the walls of Shabbos and the walls of a sukkah could both be made with lavud. That's if you have a space of less than 3 tfachim between beams, you could have vertical sticks forming the wall, and you could have a space of 3 tfachim between the sticks, and it counts as a complete wall. However, says the Mishnah, the laws of Shabbos are stricter than the laws of Sukkah, because in Shabbos you need an additional halacha that you have a total of more actual built-up space, more stick width, than you have spaces. You have to have Omin Meruba al ha-parutz, which means you have to have more solid rather than more of the gaps. So Sukkah, you don't have to have that. So you see that Shabbos has a stringency that Sukkah doesn't have. So that means that Sukkah is not necessarily kosher as a wall for Hilchos Shabbos. Gemara says the Gemara answers, Rava will say that that's talking about a Sukkah that's not Shabbos, and a Shabbos that's not, and a wall for Shabbos which is not a Sukkah. We're comparing Sukkah to Shabbos. We're not talking about a Sukkah on Shabbos, a Shabbos of Sukkot where you have a kosher Sukkah. There, even though it does not qualify generally as a Sukkah, it qualifies as a kosher. There, even though it does not generally qualify as a wall for Shabbos, it qualifies in this instance because it's a kosher Sukkah specifically. So Gemara says, well, if that's the case, then why don't you go the other way also? Why don't you teach me that it qualifies as a Sukkah if it qualifies for Hilchos Shabbos? Because there's a special leniency in Hilchos Shabbos that does not apply as far as the Sukkah is concerned. And that is that on Shabbos you don't have to have the tefach soichek. You don't have to have a tefach on the third wall. You could just have a tzuras pesach. You have 2 parallel walls to each other and a beam running across the corners. That creates a third wall, and that's kosher without having to have a tefach soichek, without having to have an extra tefach. So we should say that halacha also. We should say that since it's kosher as a wall for Hilchos Shabbos, it's also kosher as a sukkah. So Gemara answers, yes, that halacha is true, but we don't have to say that, and we don't have to spell it out. And the reason we don't have to spell it out is because the halachos of Shabbos are stricter than the halachos of sukkah. So if I told you that a sukkah qualifies a wall to be kosher even in a stricter realm of halacha. A sukkah makes even Shabbos, which is stricter than it, to a kosher wall. So then certainly a wall which is kosher for Hilchos Shabbos will be kosher for the halachas of sukkah itself. Now the Gemara brings the other two statements that Rava said, in which a wall which is kosher for Hilchos Shabbos counts as a sukkah. Rava says if you have, specifically in this case, you have two parallel walls and the opening on one end between them is covered by a beam. You have just a beam across the top. That's kosher for a sukkah. You could just throw schach across the top of it, and you could use it for a sukkah, at least on Shabbos, because it qualifies as walls, as three walls in Hilchos Shabbos, therefore it also qualifies as three walls in Hilchos Sukkah. And the other thing he said was that you have the halacha of pasi birais, where Chazal made a special leniency for people to be able to access a well, and they said that if you have a well in the open area, you could just put four corner pieces around it, even though the corner pieces don't reach each other and they're not within 3 tachim of each other. 4 corner pieces set up in the 4 corners of a frame, without the frame, an imaginary frame around the well, makes it permitted for people to consider the well to be in Rishos Yachid. So you could just throw schach across the top of that, and that'll be kosher for a sukkah as well, says Rava. So Gemara says, why does Rav have to say all these 3 halachas? So the Gemara says, well, the halacha that sukkah is a kosher for Hilchos Shabbos, that he had to say because that's showing that you can go from a more lenient halacha to a strict halacha. These other 2, showing that something which is kosher for Hilchos Shabbos is kosher for sukkah, each one has its own chiddush. The case of the 2 walls, there you only have 2 walls. So the chiddush is that with only 2 walls, it's still kosher to put schach across the top because it's kosher in Hilchos Shabbos. In the case of the 4 corner pieces, you have 4 walls, but none of them are kosher walls. So it's a greater chiddush in the sense that you don't have any kosher walls, and it's less of a chiddush in the sense that you at least have 4 something on each of the 4 sides. Okay, now the Gemara refers back to our Mishnah. The Mishnah had said that you have to have more shade than sun. The Gemara says that's only as far as the roof is concerned, as far as the schach is concerned. If the walls are built in such a way that they let in a lot of sun, that's not a problem. Even if the walls let in more sun than they create a shade, that's not a problem. That is the opinion of the Chachamim. The Gemara says Rav Yishaya disagrees. Rav Yishaya says, no, you have to have more sun than shade in the walls, created by the walls as well. What's a machlokes based on? The Gemara says it's based on how you understand a pasuk that describes the paroches, the curtain which partitioned off the kodesh from the kodesh kedashim. The Torah calls it a sechacha. It says v'sakoisa al haroines ha paroches. It calls it tzchach. Now, how could you call that tzchach? It's not tzchach. It's a vertical wall. So Gemara says, Rav Yishai says, so you see that a vertical wall is also sometimes referred to as schach, and therefore just like you have a halacha concerning schach, you have to have more shade than sun, the same halacha applies to the walls. The Rabbanan say, no, that's to teach you that the parochas actually was curved, it had to fold, and at the top it had to bend horizontally for part of the way. That's why it says the word v'sakosa. Okay, now the Gemara quotes a statement of Abaye, lists a number of Tanaim who all hold that the sukkah has to be sturdy and strong enough and comfortable enough to qualify as a permanent dwelling. Who are these? So Gemara says Rav Yishai, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Shammai, Rabbi Eliezer, and Achirim, all of them. Each one in an independent halacha that they say hold of this concept. So where do you see each one? So the Gemara spells out each one at a time. Rabbi holds that the minimum size for sukkah is 4 amos by 4 amos. That again is because he wants to have a space, a room that's comfortable enough to be a permanent dwelling. Rav Yishaya, that's the halacha we just said. They have to have walls providing more shade than sun. The next one is Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says that a sukkah is kosher even if it's 20 amos high. That's obviously because he holds it's not a problem if the walls are very strong. It's not like the opinion of the Chachamim who hold that the walls have to be weak enough that they can't stand 20 amos high. Rav Shimon holds you have to have 3 walls plus an extra piece. It means you have to have practically 4 walls of a sukkah. And the Gemara said he learned that out of a pasuk that described the sukkah as protecting you from the rain. So again, he wants it to be a sturdy structure. The next one on the list is Rabban Gamliel. He holds that a sukkah in a ship or on a wagon is not good. The reason that is puzzle because it's not a sturdy and comfortable enough structure. It's moving around, it's too high and too susceptible to the winds when it's on the deck of a ship, and it's moving around too much when it's in a wagon. Next, the Gemara says on the list was Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai holds that the minimum size of a sukkah has to fit your table in it. Again, it's got to be comfortable enough to be like a house. It has to fit your table within it. But so argue would not hold this way. And the next on the list is Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer holds that you cannot have a lean-to sukkah. That means you have to have a separate wall and roof. You cannot have one angled board, one angled schach form the roof and the wall. And again, that's because that's not kosher, that's not comfortable enough as a house. And the last one is the Cherem. Cherem holds you cannot have a circular sukkah. That would not be comfortable as a house. A house has to have corners. With a circular house, it would not be a normal house, and therefore that would not be kosher as a sukkah. And therefore all these opinions hold that your house, your sukkah, has to qualify as a
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.